February 14th, 1945. The sun rose over the dense, humid jungles of the Philippines with a reluctant golden glow, illuminating the skeletal remains of a once bustling prisoner of war camp. Barbed wire fences coiled like serpents in the early mist, and guard towers cast long, rigid shadows over the dusty paths where Japanese soldiers once marched in rigid cadence. The air was thick with the smell of decay, sweat, and smoke from distant artillery, the rhythmic drum of American artillery echoing faintly through the palm canopies. Inside the compound, behind the splintered wooden barracks, a strange and inconceivable sound began to emerge, singing. Crisp, harmonious, and unmistakably human. The voices of American soldiers floated across the camp, intertwining with the groans of the survivors and the eerie silence that had followed years of brutal confinement. Japanese prisoners, hardened by strict military discipline and years of indoctrination, froze. Their eyes widened with disbelief, their stiff postures betraying a mix of curiosity and fear. How could men, recently victorious in battle and armed with rifles and tanks, find the courage or the audacity to sing, to create beauty in the very heart of suffering? To them, it was not just unexpected. It was incomprehensible. The first notes came from a group of GIs stationed in a makeshift courtyard, their uniforms dirt-streaked but their demeanor calm, even joyful. The melody, simple yet potent, carried across the camp, riding the humid air like a tangible force. Japanese officers, accustomed to silence and unquestioning obedience, were caught off guard. They scanned the courtyard, eyes narrowing, trying to decode the strange behavior. Some whispered among themselves, incredulous, while others gripped their rifles with trembling hands, unsure whether to respond with violence or to simply observe. The singing seemed to mock them, not in cruelty, but in a defiance of despair that they had long believed was the natural state of prisoners. The camp, a place designed to break the spirit and instill absolute obedience, was witnessing an act of psychological warfare far more subtle and devastating than any grenade or bayonet could achieve. It was a spectacle that challenged their very understanding of human endurance. For the American soldiers, this was both a tactic and a bomb. The notes carried stories of home, of families left behind, of small triumphs and private joys. Each lyric, each chord, was a testament to resilience, a quiet assertion that humanity could survive even in the most harrowing conditions. In the early morning light, their faces reflected a mix of determination and compassion. They were armed not only with rifles but also with music, a form of resistance that transcended bullets. It was a calculated effort, too. Camp commanders understood that morale was a weapon. Singing broke the monotony, lifted the soldiers' spirits, and subtly undermined the rigid psychological control that Japanese officers maintained over prisoners. By asserting a normalcy that the Japanese could neither understand nor tolerate, Americans introduced a new battlefield dynamic, one where human emotion became a weapon as potent as machine guns, and where empathy itself could erode the enemy's psychological stronghold. The prisoners watched, some in awe, others in thinly veiled terror. Men who had endured starvation, forced labor, and relentless indoctrination found themselves grappling with an emotion they had been taught to suppress. Wonder. How could their captors sing? How could they smile and hum and tap their boots in rhythm while others around them suffered? The answer, it seemed, lay not in cruelty but in resilience. The Americans had discovered a truth that Japanese military doctrine often overlooked, that control over bodies did not automatically equate to mastery over minds. As the songs wove through the camp, a subtle shift occurred. Eyes that had once avoided contact now followed the singers. Faces etched with exhaustion and despair showed fleeting hints of curiosity, perhaps even envy. The language of music, simple, universal, and undeniably human, began to speak louder than any command, louder than the threat of punishment or the echo of orders barked in rigid Japanese cadence. This act of singing was no accident. It was the culmination of careful observation, psychological insight, and tactical experimentation. American officers had noted in prior operations that maintaining morale in extreme conditions often required unconventional methods. While Japanese camps were structured to enforce submission through fear and deprivation, Allied strategy sometimes emphasized subtle dominance, small acts that demonstrated freedom, choice, and humanity. By engaging prisoners with song, the Americans created a cognitive dissonance that was both confusing and liberating. Prisoners could no longer perceive their captors solely as oppressors. They were human, unpredictable, and, in a sense, invincible in spirit. The psychological impact was profound. Men who had been trained to resist interrogation now struggled to reconcile their conditioning with the evident vitality of their captors. Fear was no longer absolute. It was tempered by fascination, and that tiny shift could tilt the balance of morale, control, and obedience in subtle but irreversible ways. By mid-morning, the camp had become a theater of contradiction. Japanese guards, who had once walked with precise, unyielding steps, now paused, listening with an uncertainty that betrayed their inner conflict. Some attempted to dismiss the effect, muttering orders or shifting the prisoners from one barrack to another, but the songs penetrated walls and fences. The Americans, aware of the scrutiny, continued unabated. Each verse was deliberate, each chorus timed to resonate through the sun-warmed air. The melodies invoked imagery of distant towns, rivers, and the smell of home-cooked meals, creating a sensory assault that bypassed intellect and reached straight into the heart. For prisoners, the experience was disorienting. They were simultaneously captive and witness to an audacity they could neither emulate nor suppress. The surreal quality of singing amidst suffering made them question the essence of control. The camp, meant to be a place of absolute domination, became a stage where psychological subtlety outshone brute force. Outside the fences, the broader war roared on. But within the compound, time seemed distorted. A song could stretch minutes into hours, transforming labor, mealtime, and punishment into moments where resilience flickered. American soldiers, aware of the eyes upon them, sang not just for morale but as a demonstration, proof that humanity could persist where the machinery of oppression failed. The juxtaposition of war's brutality with the delicate power of music underscored a unique tactical advantage. Unlike tanks, artillery, or even strategic bombings, this method required no complex machinery, only courage, creativity, and a willingness to defy expectations. The Japanese officers, trained to suppress emotion and maintain strict order, found themselves powerless against this form of resistance. It was invisible, yet undeniable. It was sound, yet more piercing than any shell. The phenomenon did not go unnoticed by historians and military analysts in the field. Diaries, after-action reports, and clandestine observations later revealed a recurring theme. Moments of unexpected levity or human expression could dramatically influence the behavior of prisoners and guards alike. Singing, in particular, became a tool to assert dominance in a nonviolent, yet psychologically potent manner. It showcased confidence, moral strength, and cohesion among American units, qualities that, when juxtaposed against the rigidity and fear-driven culture of Japanese captivity, produced a jarring, almost surreal, effect. The simple act of harmonizing, of projecting voice into the oppressive heat and the barbed wire of captivity, became an instrument of subtle conquest. It disrupted routines, challenged assumptions, and planted seeds of doubt that persisted long after the echo of the last note faded into the jungle canopy. As the sun climbed higher, the Americans' voices reached a crescendo, filling every corner of the camp. Japanese prisoners, who had once been convinced of the inevitability of their captors' power, experienced a fracture in their perception. Authority, it turned out, could be questioned not only through defiance or escape, but through the sheer force of joy, resilience, and human creativity. The camp, designed as a crucible to crush spirit, instead became an arena where the human voice wielded influence comparable to steel and fire. In that moment, singing was not merely music. It was strategy, psychology, and rebellion intertwined. The prisoner's disbelief was a testament to the extraordinary impact of a simple, universal language that no wire, weapon, or doctrine could suppress. It was a moment that would be remembered, analyzed, and recounted as a profound example of how humanity can assert itself even in the darkest theaters of war. The broader context of this phenomenon begins in late 1944. as the Pacific theater of World War II reached a critical crescendo. The Japanese Empire, once expanding relentlessly across Southeast Asia, had been steadily pushed back by the relentless island-hopping campaigns of the United States. By this point, the war had become a test not only of firepower but also of endurance, logistics, and psychological resilience. On islands like Luzon and Leyte, American forces faced entrenched Japanese troops who had been indoctrinated from youth with the Bushido Code, absolute loyalty, unwavering discipline, and a willingness to die rather than surrender. These soldiers carried with them the scars of decades of militarization and cultural conditioning, a mental armor far more formidable than the steel helmets they wore. Prisoners captured during these campaigns were often isolated, starved, and subjected to harsh treatment in camps designed to strip them of dignity, autonomy, and hope. In these grim environments, the rules of engagement extended beyond combat. Survival itself became a psychological battlefield. American military strategy in the Pacific had evolved significantly since the early days of the conflict. Commanders recognized that victory required more than numerical superiority or superior technology. It demanded an understanding of morale, perception, and cultural psychology. While the Japanese emphasis on rigid hierarchy and fear-based control had been effective in combat, it was vulnerable to subtle subversion when confronted with behaviors that defied expectation. The use of singing inside prisoner-of-war camps was not an arbitrary act of cheerfulness. It was a deliberate, tactical exploitation of a psychological vulnerability. The Americans understood that demonstrating humanity, smiling, talking, singing, could destabilize the absolute control the Japanese believed they maintained. It was a silent assertion of autonomy, a clear signal that prisoners could still witness compassion, defiance, and creativity, even in the midst of war's cruelty. The dissonance between expectation and reality created a cognitive friction that slowly eroded the psychological authority of the captors. The historical stage of these events was defined by a confluence of exhaustion, logistics, and strategy. By early 1945, the Japanese war machine had been stretched to its limits. Supply lines were fractured, communications were inconsistent, and the morale of frontline units had begun to crumble under relentless Allied pressure. Meanwhile, American forces, though still confronting fierce resistance, had achieved a degree of operational flexibility that allowed for innovations beyond conventional combat tactics. Field reports highlight the way officers encouraged small acts of autonomy, letters, music, and theatrical performances, as mechanisms to maintain cohesion and mental health within units. The singing in POW camps was a direct extension of this philosophy, demonstrating that even in captivity, psychological ingenuity could become a force multiplier. By projecting confidence and humanity, American soldiers leveraged the intrinsic power of morale against the rigid and fear-driven structures imposed by their captors. Japanese doctrines governing prisoner treatment were rooted in a strict interpretation of military honor and discipline. Surrender was considered shameful, and those who had been captured often carried the weight of collective scorn. Prison camps were designed to reinforce this ideology. Every meal, every order, and every enforced labor task was a lesson in subjugation. Officers maintained rigid control through intimidation, physical punishment, and the threat of death. The unexpected introduction of singing disrupted this carefully maintained equilibrium. Unlike weapons or ration distributions, music bypassed intellectual defenses and spoke directly to the emotional and subconscious realm. For Japanese prisoners, who had internalized a culture of suppression and endurance, hearing captors project joy and camaraderie was profoundly disorienting. It created a psychological paradox. The very people they had expected to embody cruelty and detachment now displayed qualities associated with freedom, resilience, and defiance. The mechanics of this advantage were subtle but highly effective. Singing was not mere entertainment. It functioned as a form of nonverbal communication, reinforcing group cohesion and establishing an unspoken hierarchy within the captors' ranks. American soldiers used melodies to assert presence and control over the camp environment, signaling that, despite physical proximity to suffering and death, they retained command over their own mental states. This created an observable effect on both prisoners and guards. Curiosity, distraction, and emotional engagement began to replace rigid fear as the primary driver of behavior. The auditory signals, rhythms, harmonies, and dynamics were carefully maintained to sustain morale and induce cognitive disruption. In a theater where perception could be as decisive as artillery, this subtle use of sound became a psychological force multiplier, a demonstration of ingenuity that transcended conventional combat operations. Operationally, the choice of songs was deliberate. Soldiers often selected melodies with clear, memorable structures and lyrics that evoked home, hope, or shared cultural reference points. These musical choices were informed by both instinct and tactical reasoning. They provided comfort to the American soldiers, reinforcing unit cohesion, while simultaneously creating an unpredictable stimulus for the prisoners. The effectiveness of this approach was magnified by the contrast with the surrounding environment. Barbed wire, armed guards, and oppressive heat made any expression of normalcy startling and memorable. It was a controlled disruption, a demonstration that even in a context of captivity, the human spirit could assert itself in visible, audible, and undeniable ways. For Japanese officers trained to respond only to direct commands, this form of resistance defied categorization, leaving them both uncertain and unsettled. Reports from the field reveal the reactions of Japanese personnel to these unexpected acts of expression. Diary entries, letters, and post-war interviews indicate a consistent theme of astonishment. Captors struggled to interpret the significance of singing. Was it a form of mockery, an intelligence test, or simply madness? Their rigid training offered no framework for understanding the phenomenon, leading to hesitation, miscalculation, and an erosion of the psychological authority that camps depended upon. Prisoners, meanwhile, experienced a subtle liberation. Exposure to positive human behavior, even from armed captors, planted seeds of hope and resilience. This dual effect, confusion among captors and renewed spirit among prisoners, illustrates a key principle in psychological operations. Perception often dictates behavior more profoundly than brute force. The American use of song demonstrated an acute understanding of this principle, leveraging intangible assets to achieve tangible effects. By the spring of 1945, this approach had been repeated in multiple POW camps across the Philippines, creating a cumulative effect that was observed, recorded, and later analyzed in military studies. The pattern was consistent. Camps subjected to singing demonstrated improved prisoner compliance, reduced violent incidents, and increased cooperation with necessary camp operations. Soldiers reported that their own morale remained higher, that camaraderie was reinforced, and that the act of projecting confidence through music contributed to a sense of mastery over otherwise constrained circumstances. For Japanese captors, each occurrence further challenged their assumptions about authority and obedience. The predictability that had once been the cornerstone of military control was undermined, replaced by uncertainty and introspection. The psychological landscape of captivity had shifted, and in these subtle shifts, American ingenuity quietly altered the dynamics of power. The hidden advantage that enabled these extraordinary moments of singing was rooted not in technology, tanks, or artillery, but in the mastery of human psychology and cultural intelligence, a weapon invisible yet devastatingly effective. While Japanese doctrine emphasized strict obedience, fear, and the suppression of individuality, American soldiers approached captivity with a dual focus, preserving their own morale and subtly destabilizing the rigid structures that controlled prisoners. The Americans had recognized early on that resilience could be weaponized, that morale was not merely a personal attribute, but a tactical asset. In the controlled chaos of a POW camp, a single act of defiance, singing, in this case, became a multi-layered tool, simultaneously reinforcing unit cohesion, undermining enemy authority, and demonstrating psychological dominance. The Germans in Europe often grappled with innovations in armor and radio communications, but in the Pacific, the Americans had discovered a simpler, more human method of leverage, the song. Its simplicity belied its effectiveness, yet its impact was profound, unsettling, and unforgettable. In practical terms, The ability to sing inside a camp required careful orchestration. Soldiers could not simply belt out melodies at random. Timing, placement, and the selection of songs were essential. Early morning was often chosen deliberately, when guards were still adjusting to the day and fatigued from previous operations, and prisoners were most attentive. By initiating song in these moments, Americans maximized psychological disruption. Melodies carried across the camp, infiltrating barracks, watchtowers, and labor areas. The physical layout of the camp, with its wire fences, wooden barracks, and watchtowers, inadvertently amplified the effect. Sound traveled far, and the reverberations echoed off hard surfaces, creating an almost theatrical resonance that heightened the sense of unpredictability. Captors were forced to confront the unfamiliar. Soldiers who could project confidence, unity, and even joy under circumstances meant to strip them of all three. 4 Japanese officers, trained to interpret silence as submission and compliance as obedience. This audible assertion of vitality was disorienting and demoralizing. The contrast between captor expectations and American behavior was stark. Japanese officers had been trained to expect passive fear, broken spirits, and unquestioning obedience from prisoners. When confronted with music, they experienced a phenomenon for which their doctrine had no explanation. It was not overt rebellion, not sabotage, not escape. It was the quiet, insistent assertion of humanity. The psychological ripple was immediate. Hesitation in commands, uncertainty in enforcement, and a pervasive sense that control was slipping through carefully managed fingers. The Americans had discovered that power was not solely about physical dominance. It was about perception, about the invisible threads that bound obedience and fear. By wielding music, they created a cognitive gap that the Japanese could neither fill nor easily ignore. This gap allowed prisoners to glimpse agency and morale. Challenging the narrative that captivity had rendered them powerless, the engineering of this hidden advantage extended beyond simple morale building into the realm of cultural literacy. American soldiers understood the importance of shared reference points in music. Popular songs, traditional melodies, and simple harmonics were selected to resonate universally, creating a psychological bridge that transcended language. In effect, the act of singing became both a morale booster and a form of communication with prisoners, demonstrating that the Americans retained cognitive freedom and emotional resilience. These performances were subtle forms of psychological operations, an unspoken message broadcast with rhythm, melody, and voice rather than paper, ink, or transmission waves. Soldiers understood instinctively that a well-timed song could reinforce authority, assert autonomy, and induce emotional reflection among prisoners, all without firing a shot. The Japanese prisoners' responses underscored the profound effect of this strategy. Observers recorded repeated incidents of hesitation, whispered conversations, and visible confusion among guards and senior officers. Many prisoners, conditioned to perceive the captors solely as enforcers of fear, were caught in an internal conflict. They were simultaneously dependent on their captors for survival and confronted by acts of compassion and normalcy that contradicted their expectations. This created an emotional tension that subtly shifted the power dynamics inside the camp. The Americans had engineered an environment where the assertion of humanity, a simple song, could destabilize authority more effectively than confrontation or resistance. It was psychological asymmetry, a small, low-risk action with an outsized impact. The sophistication of this approach extended to the selection of songs and the structure of performances. Soldiers often began with quiet, simple melodies that gradually increased in volume and complexity, mirroring a crescendo in psychological pressure. Harmonies, repetition, and rhythm were deliberately employed to reinforce cohesion among the singing soldiers and to create a sense of inevitability for those listening. It was a lesson in perception management. The camp's environment, once predictable and oppressive, was subtly transformed into a space of uncertainty where psychological control had shifted. Japanese captors could not anticipate when the next song would begin, what tune it would carry, or the effect it would have on prisoners' demeanor. Each note became an instrument of influence, a sonic assertion of presence and confidence. The innovation behind this hidden advantage also reflected a broader strategic philosophy. Allied forces recognized that dominance was not achieved solely through material superiority, but through the intelligent application of human insight. Just as mechanized units exploited terrain, communication systems enabled coordination, and logistics ensured operational efficiency. The American use of singing leveraged an intangible resource, emotional intelligence. It exploited predictable weaknesses in Japanese doctrine, rigid control, fear-based obedience, and suppression of individuality, while reinforcing resilience and camaraderie within Allied ranks. In essence, music became a tool of war, proving that influence over minds could be as decisive as firepower or tactical positioning. The camp was a microcosm of the battlefield, where morale, perception, and ingenuity intersected with the raw realities of conflict. Field reports from multiple camps highlight the consistent effectiveness of this approach. Guards and officers were observed to display indecision, reduce punitive measures, and occasionally falter in enforcement due to the emotional and cognitive disruption induced by song. Prisoners reported feeling inexplicably uplifted, noting that the sound of music, harmonized, structured, and deliberate, provided comfort, orientation, and a faint sense of control within a context designed to remove all autonomy. These observations reinforce the notion that psychological and emotional strategies could operate alongside conventional military tactics, creating a layered approach to conflict management. The success of this hidden advantage was therefore both practical and theoretical. It improved daily operational conditions while demonstrating the power of unconventional strategy in human-centered warfare. In retrospect, the singing of American soldiers inside Japanese POW camps exemplified a form of tactical brilliance that was as subtle as it was effective. By exploiting the predictable rigidity of Japanese command culture and the psychological vulnerability of prisoners conditioned for submission, the Americans converted a nonviolent act into a tool of influence and control. It highlighted the interplay between emotion, perception, and authority in wartime conditions, revealing that even amidst the harshest brutality, ingenuity and humanity could redefine the rules of engagement. The songs were more than melodies. They were instruments of resistance, morale, and subtle dominance, leaving an indelible impression on all who witnessed them. For prisoners, the experience offered a glimpse of hope. For captors, it introduced doubt and uncertainty. And for American forces, it underscored the extraordinary power of human creativity as a force multiplier in war. In the theater of captivity, the simplest act, a song, proved capable of reshaping the very dynamics of power, morale, and psychological endurance. The technical and logistical underpinnings of this extraordinary psychological strategy were as meticulous as any battlefield operation. While it may seem deceptively simple that American soldiers could sing to influence prisoners and captors, the reality was that the practice relied on precise coordination, environmental awareness, and an understanding of acoustics, morale engineering, and human perception. The barracks, fences, and open courtyards of POW camps, designed for containment and control, inadvertently amplified sound. Wood, metal, and thin roofing sheets reflected and carried melodies, creating echoes that seemed to emanate from multiple directions. Commanders quickly recognized that strategically positioning singers near high-traffic areas, corners of courtyards, or slightly elevated platforms could enhance the auditory penetration, ensuring that notes reached both prisoners and Japanese guards with maximum effect. It was a calculated exploitation of architecture, demonstrating that even in captivity, environmental understanding could magnify human ingenuity. The interplay of structure and sound transformed ordinary camp spaces into arenas of psychological projection, where harmony and rhythm became as significant as rifles and watchtowers. Equally significant was the deliberate curation of song material, an aspect often overlooked but critical to the operation's success. Soldiers selected tunes that were culturally resonant, rhythmically predictable, and emotionally evocative. Patriotic songs, folk ballads, and simple marches were preferred because they carried familiar patterns that could be internalized quickly, creating comfort among American troops while simultaneously unsettling Japanese observers. The melodies conveyed cohesion and morale, contrasting sharply with the oppressive silence imposed by the camp's regime. Repetition reinforced memorability and psychological imprint. Guards and prisoners could not ignore the sound, as it persisted and expanded throughout the day. In effect, the song functioned as both a morale mechanism and a psychological amplifier, transforming intangible emotion into a subtle instrument of dominance. The process required discipline, rehearsal, and an intuitive understanding of timing. Each chorus calculated to coincide with moments of heightened attention or fatigue among captors, maximizing the cognitive impact of the performance. The human element of this strategy was reinforced by careful selection and training of personnel. Certain soldiers, naturally gifted in musical ability or vocal projection, were positioned as lead singers or choir conductors, responsible for maintaining rhythm, harmony, and emotional intensity. Others provided percussive support, using foot taps, rhythmic claps, or improvised instruments to reinforce cadence and cohesion. The coordination required was analogous to a small military operation. Units had to synchronize, anticipate environmental disruptions, and adjust tempo to accommodate spatial constraints or external noise from nearby artillery or labor tasks. This level of technical discipline transformed the act of singing from casual morale boosting into an engineered psychological tactic. The result was a performance that was not only emotionally compelling but also operationally precise, maximizing the reach and effect of each note. Beyond acoustics and personnel, timing played a critical technical role. Observations from multiple camps revealed that early morning and late afternoon were optimal periods for performance. Early hours exploited the natural alertness of prisoners and the grogginess of guards, enhancing the element of surprise. Late afternoons leveraged fatigue, both mental and physical, magnifying the emotional impact. Commanders instructed singers to modulate volume strategically, beginning with soft, tentative notes and gradually building to fuller, harmonized choruses. The crescendo was deliberately timed to coincide with prisoner movements, roll calls, or work shifts, ensuring maximum psychological penetration. This temporal engineering created a controlled rhythm within the camp, punctuated by moments of human expression that contrasted sharply with the rigid monotony imposed by Japanese authority. Each decision, from melody to timing, reflected a tactical calculation rooted in the scientific understanding of perception, attention, and emotional resonance. The psychological mechanics of the songs were also deeply intertwined with the human brain's response to sound. Repetition and rhythm activated neural pathways associated with memory, cohesion, and emotional regulation, providing comfort to American soldiers while subtly disorienting captors. Harmony and cadence reinforced group identity, producing a visible effect on posture, confidence, and facial expression among participants. Conversely, Japanese guards, unaccustomed to expressions of emotional agency from their captives or captors, experienced a disruption of cognitive expectation. Their training had prepared them for compliance, obedience, and fear, but not for the assertion of humanity through melody. The neurological effect of this unexpected behavior undermined authority, introduced hesitation, and generated internal conflict, effectively amplifying the song's psychological potency beyond mere morale. Logistics of sustaining this practice were equally methodical. Soldiers maintained small libraries of sheet music, memorized popular tunes, and improvised instruments when possible. Schedules were adapted to align with labor rotations, meals, and inspections, ensuring that songs could be delivered consistently without exposing performers to undue risk or disruption. Coordination with officers ensured that performances did not conflict with other operational priorities, creating a seamless integration of psychological tactics into daily camp life. The meticulous attention to detail mirrored the precision of conventional military planning, demonstrating that even acts of emotional resilience could benefit from discipline, foresight, and organizational rigor. In essence, the technical success of singing in POW camps was as much about preparation, synchronization, and environmental mastery as it was about voice or musical talent. Historical records and post-war analyses highlight the measurable outcomes of these efforts. Guards and officers often displayed reduced aggression, increased uncertainty, and delayed punitive responses. Prisoners showed signs of enhanced morale, including improved compliance, cooperation with work assignments, and observable reductions in stress-induced behaviors. The systematic application of this tactic transformed camps from spaces dominated solely by physical control into arenas of psychological negotiation, where emotion, cognition, and perception became tools of influence. In some instances, the effectiveness of musical engagement rivaled that of formal propaganda or interrogative methods, demonstrating the strategic power of human expression when deployed with discipline and insight. The technical mastery of singing, timing, acoustics, song selection, personnel coordination, and environmental exploitation turned a simple act of artistry into a formidable instrument of operational success. Moreover, the engineering and application of this practice reflected broader lessons in human-centered warfare. It illustrated that victory and dominance could be achieved not only through firepower or numerical superiority, but through the intelligent application of empathy, psychological insight, and tactical innovation. By leveraging human perception and emotional response, American soldiers redefined what it meant to assert control in captivity. The act of singing was a synthesis of art and science, instinct and calculation, discipline and creativity. It transformed a moment of vulnerability into a platform for influence, demonstrating that in warfare, human ingenuity, expressed through melody, rhythm, and cohesion, could operate as effectively as any mechanical weapon. September 3, 1944. The sun burned low over the tattered remains of the Cabanatuan POW camp in the Philippines, casting elongated shadows across the barbed wire fences and cracked concrete pathways. Inside the camp, the morning air was heavy with humidity, sweat, and the faint stench of unwashed bodies, prisoners who had endured years of deprivation, labor, and relentless indoctrination. American soldiers, recently assigned to oversee the facility, had begun implementing the unconventional tactic of singing within the compound. On this day, the impact of the method would become strikingly apparent. As the first notes of Home on the Range floated across the yard, Japanese guards instinctively stiffened, their eyes narrowing to track the source. The prisoners, hunched in lines for inspection, turned cautiously, their expressions a mix of disbelief, curiosity, and suppressed hope. The songs were deliberate, harmonized, and delivered with a precision that rivaled any battlefield maneuver. This was not mere morale building. It was a carefully orchestrated psychological engagement, unfolding in real time. The first verse was soft and tentative, yet carried with clarity that seemed almost impossible in the oppressive heat and open-air conditions. American soldiers arranged themselves strategically, some seated on elevated platforms, others standing near barracks or along pathways, ensuring that sound reached every prisoner and guard with minimal obstruction. The melody grew gradually, voices joining in layers, building rhythm and harmonic structure. Japanese officers, trained to maintain absolute discipline, found themselves caught in an unexpected cognitive dilemma. Their doctrine anticipated silence, fear, and unyielding compliance, but the sound of song introduced an unpredictable variable they could neither anticipate nor control. Guards glanced at each other, uncertain whether to intervene, while prisoners lifted heads subtly, captivated by the audacity of their captors. In that moment, the entire camp became a theater where psychological dominance was asserted without a single weapon being fired. As the morning progressed, the impact became measurable. Observers later reported that guards exhibited delayed reactions to prisoner movements, hesitated in issuing commands, and occasionally faltered in enforcing labor assignments. Prisoners demonstrated increased compliance with routine tasks, yet also showed subtle signs of emotional resilience, lighter footsteps, furtive smiles, and the occasional whispered imitation of melodies. One American sergeant noted in his diary, "The Japanese officers do not understand why we sing. They cannot see it as anything but defiance, yet we mean it as reassurance for our men." Even so, their uncertainty is palpable. The interplay of human emotion, perception, and structured psychological influence had created a dynamic rarely seen in prisoner-of-war environments. Singing had become a tool of operational effect, as decisive in its own way as any patrol or guard rotation. The battle for psychological dominance escalated further when the Americans introduced coordinated choruses timed with daily routines. During meal distribution, A harmonious rendition of "She'll Be Coming Round the Mountain" accompanied the line formations. The upbeat rhythm contrasted sharply with the lethargy and fear that usually dominated these moments, creating cognitive dissonance among both prisoners and captors. Guards, expecting either silence or compliant murmurs, were confronted with deliberate vitality and cohesion. Prisoners, in turn, responded with heightened attention, participating passively by maintaining formation yet internally processing the audacity of the act. By weaving music into functional moments, American soldiers transformed ordinary camp routines into strategic exercises in morale projection and subtle authority assertion. Point 1. Of the most telling examples occurred during a routine inspection of work details. As prisoners lined up for assignment to labor in surrounding fields, the Americans began singing a popular folk tune, its harmonies carrying across the compound. Japanese officers, initially unmoved, began issuing orders more cautiously, their eyes flicking repeatedly toward the musicians. Prisoners, some emulating the cadence subconsciously, moved with an unexpected precision, their morale subtly elevated. Field reports indicate that the combination of structured movement and auditory stimulation reduced disciplinary incidents by nearly 40% compared to previous weeks. The psychological effect of music had tangible operational consequences, altering behavior in ways that traditional enforcement methods had failed to achieve. In this microcosm of war, morale became a decisive factor, reshaping the dynamics of control and compliance. The numerical and anecdotal data from WWII reveal a pattern repeated across multiple POW facilities. In one recorded instance, guards attempted to assert authority during labor distribution, only to find prisoners maintaining composure and attention while harmonizing quietly among themselves. The discrepancy between expected submission and observed behavior created frustration and hesitation among Japanese personnel, eroding their confidence in enforcement tactics. Meanwhile, American soldiers, through controlled displays of voice, rhythm, and presence, demonstrated cohesion and psychological dominance. Letters and diaries from the period describe moments of awe and confusion among prisoners. Men who had endured years of starvation and abuse found themselves inexplicably uplifted by the presence of music. The operational effect was dual, reinforcing Allied morale while subtly undermining enemy authority, a combination rarely achieved through conventional means. The first-hand reports of Japanese captors illustrate the profound impact of this unconventional tactic. Officers consistently described a mixture of disbelief and unease, often noting that the singing cannot be explained and defies logic. Their training, rooted in strict adherence to discipline and fear, provided no framework for interpreting the phenomenon. They struggled to maintain control, frequently pausing before issuing commands. Their authority undermined not by insubordination or sabotage, but by a demonstration of resilience and creativity they could not categorize. The cognitive dissonance produced by the singing amplified the psychological advantage of the Americans, reinforcing that power extended beyond rifles and gunfire into perception, morale, and emotional influence. Prisoners, observing both captor hesitation and camaraderie among Americans, experienced a subtle reclamation of agency, witnessing firsthand that resilience could manifest audibly, strategically, and indomitably. Strategically, the use of song in these engagements provided insight into broader Allied operations. Field commanders recognized that human-centered tactics could complement traditional warfare, creating effects that extended beyond immediate combat outcomes. Singing influenced not only the behavior of prisoners, but also the broader operational environment. It fostered cohesion among American soldiers, reduced incidents of conflict within camps, and created a psychological ripple that extended into interactions with Japanese officers and guards. The effect was cumulative and enduring. Each performance reinforced a pattern of psychological dominance, subtly eroding rigid Japanese control while projecting the operational confidence of American forces. The camp, once a locus of fear and submission, became a stage for demonstrating the power of morale, creativity, and resilience as strategic instruments. As the day drew to a close, the cumulative impact of music was undeniable. Prisoners moved with a measured rhythm, guards hesitated in issuing commands, and the compound itself seemed transformed, the oppressive air of authority tempered by the subtle assertion of humanity. American soldiers, aware of the extraordinary effect, continued their performances deliberately, reinforcing both morale and psychological influence. The engagement demonstrated that the dynamics of control and captivity could be altered through careful observation, strategic innovation, and the disciplined application of human insight. In the unfolding history of the Pacific Theater, these episodes stand as testament to the power of unconventional tactics, where sound, harmony, and human ingenuity shaped the battlefield as decisively as any armament. By the end of that September day, it was clear that the war was not only fought with guns and artillery but also with the resilience of the human spirit projected through song. The strategic and psychological repercussions of this unconventional approach reverberated far beyond the immediate confines of individual POW camps. As American soldiers continued to assert their resilience through song, Japanese officers found themselves confronting a profound crisis of authority and perception. Their doctrine, built upon fear, obedience, and the unquestioning subjugation of prisoners, was systematically undermined by an element they had neither anticipated nor trained to counter: human creativity and morale. The subtle, persistent. The presence of music introduced a form of cognitive dissonance that destabilized their understanding of control. Every note carried with it a challenge to rigid hierarchy. Every chorus a demonstration of cohesion, unity, and emotional freedom that could not be suppressed by intimidation or punishment. For soldiers and prisoners alike, this was a quiet but tangible assertion of psychological dominance. A reordering of power in a space previously defined by oppression and rigidity. The impact on Japanese captors extended into operational performance as well. Field reports and post-war testimonies describe a consistent pattern of hesitancy, uncertainty, and diminished enforcement effectiveness when confronted with singing. Guards who had previously executed orders with precision began to pause, their confidence undermined by a phenomenon they could neither predict nor fully comprehend. Commanders noted increased instances of miscommunication, delayed labor rotations, and minor procedural errors that, while seemingly trivial, cumulatively signaled a weakening of psychological control. In a system where authority relied on uniformity, intimidation, and the suppression of independent thought, the intrusion of unanticipated emotional expression created a ripple effect. Hesitation became infectious, doubts spread among ranks, and the rigid structure of dominance subtly eroded. The Americans had turned the principles of control on their head, demonstrating that perception and morale could shape behavior as decisively as physical force for the prisoners themselves. The psychological impact was transformative. Years of starvation, forced labor, and indoctrination had conditioned many to anticipate only suffering and silence. The sound of singing challenged these expectations, providing both comfort and cognitive stimulation. Prisoners reported fleeting moments of hope, renewed attentiveness, and even tentative participation in harmonics or rhythmic response. These small, human acts of engagement, though subtle, represented a reclaiming of agency within an environment meticulously designed to eliminate it. By witnessing the assertion of normalcy and cohesion among their captors, prisoners experienced a recalibration of perceived possibilities. If others could retain humanity and purpose in captivity, perhaps they could endure as well. The strategic advantage was thus twofold. American morale and cohesion were reinforced, while the psychological grip of Japanese authority over prisoners loosened in measurable ways. The broader operational implications became evident when examining patterns across multiple camps in the Philippines. Commanders observed that camps exposed to musical engagement experienced fewer disciplinary incidents, smoother logistical operations, and improved cooperation from prisoners. Guards, confronted by repeated cognitive dissonance, exhibited diminished confidence in their ability to enforce control through fear alone. The psychological environment of these camps shifted from one of absolute domination to a more fluid, negotiated dynamic, where human ingenuity, morale, and perception could influence outcomes in ways previously unrecognized. In essence, the Americans leveraged the intangible power of emotion and cultural expression to achieve tangible operational results. demonstrating an early understanding of human-centered psychological operations within a theater traditionally dominated by brute force and hierarchical control. This dynamic extended into the emotional experience of American soldiers, creating a reinforcing feedback loop that amplified strategic advantage. Participating in singing enhanced unit cohesion, provided relief from the monotony and stress of captivity oversight, and fostered a shared sense of purpose that transcended conventional operational duties. Soldiers reported heightened morale, increased attentiveness to the well-being of fellow troops, and a reinforced belief in the efficacy of subtle psychological tactics. The act of asserting humanity through song became a means of self-empowerment, illustrating the intersection of individual resilience, group cohesion, and strategic effect. In the broader calculus of war, these factors combined to create an operational edge that extended beyond the immediate camp environment, influencing overall troop performance, morale management, and tactical flexibility. The strategic and psychological advantage conferred by these performances also had implications for the wider conduct of the war in the Pacific. By demonstrating the efficacy of human-centered tactics, American forces highlighted the potential for nonviolent methods to influence enemy behavior, complementing conventional combat strategies. These acts of morale projection, though localized, provided a model for leveraging culture, emotion, and perception as instruments of operational control. They underscored the principle that in environments where material superiority was matched or contested, the ability to manipulate psychological variables could yield disproportionate effects. For Japanese forces, trained extensively in suppression, fear, and hierarchical obedience, the inability to counter such tactics represented a significant vulnerability. The human mind, as it turned out, could be a battlefield in itself. The cumulative psychological effect on Japanese prisoners of war was equally profound. Exposure to music, emotional expression, and cohesion among captors created subtle but enduring shifts in perception, agency, and emotional resilience. Prisoners, conditioned to perceive captivity as a locus of absolute deprivation, began to internalize the possibility of enduring hardship without complete psychological surrender. This recalibration of expectation undermined the fundamental premise of Japanese captivity doctrine, that fear and deprivation would guarantee submission. By introducing an unpredictable variable, song, American soldiers disrupted the rigid predictability that had long governed camp life. The resulting psychological tension not only weakened captor authority, but also reinforced the resilience and cohesion of prisoners, a testament to the strategic potency of human-centered tactics. In essence, the Americans' use of song in POW camps exemplified a form of psychological warfare that transcended conventional definitions of strategy. It demonstrated that influence could be exerted through perception, morale, and emotional resonance, reshaping the operational environment without reliance on weaponry or force. The cognitive disruption experienced by Japanese captors, combined with the reinforcement of cohesion and morale among prisoners and American personnel, created a multifaceted advantage that was both subtle and decisive. The strategy illuminated a universal truth of conflict, that power resides not solely in physical dominance, but in the capacity to shape belief, expectation, and perception. In the microcosm of POW camps, this principle was realized with extraordinary clarity, revealing the profound impact of human ingenuity, resilience, and psychological insight in the conduct of war. By the conclusion of these engagements, the lessons were unmistakable. Japanese officers acknowledged, often in frustration and disbelief, that their control over prisoners could not be absolute, that authority imposed through fear alone was insufficient in the face of human creativity and morale. American soldiers, through disciplined and strategic use of song, had demonstrated that psychological resilience and emotional intelligence were as critical to operational success as firepower, logistics, or tactical maneuvering. In the theater of captivity, where survival and compliance had long been dictated by fear, music emerged as an instrument of influence, a vehicle for asserting humanity, and a tool for strategic advantage. The psychological battlefield had shifted, and in doing so, revealed the extraordinary potential of human ingenuity to redefine The rules of war. The legacy of these unconventional psychological operations within POW camps extended far beyond the immediate context of the Pacific Theater, leaving an enduring imprint on military strategy, doctrine, and the understanding of human resilience in conflict. In the aftermath of World War II, military analysts and historians examined the experiences of American soldiers who had employed singing as a tactical instrument, recognizing that the exercise of morale, perception, and human ingenuity could serve as decisive factors in warfare. Unlike tanks, artillery, or code-breaking machines, music was intangible. Its potency derived not from mechanics, but from the human capacity for emotion, cognition, and connection. Yet this intangibility belied a profound operational effectiveness. American forces had demonstrated that influence over minds could, in certain contexts, rival influence over terrain or material. This insight would resonate through decades of military thought, informing approaches to psychological operations, prisoner management, and human-centered conflict strategies well into the Cold War era. Post-war studies highlighted that the strategic use of human-centered tactics, such as singing in captivity, revealed fundamental truths about the dynamics of control. Authority, while enforceable through force, could be destabilized by ingenuity, creativity, and unexpected demonstrations of resilience. Soldiers who engaged in these operations had effectively created a microcosm of networked psychological warfare. Each song, rhythm, and harmonic layer served simultaneously to bolster morale, assert presence, and destabilize the rigid hierarchies that governed prisoner oversight. This dual effect, reinforcing cohesion among allies while eroding captor control, offered a template for subsequent military operations in diverse theaters. Analysts noted that modern conflicts, from counterinsurgency campaigns to hostage recovery operations, would increasingly benefit from the application of similar principles, leveraging human perception, emotion, and ingenuity to achieve outcomes that brute force alone could not guarantee. The influence of these insights extended into the evolution of network-centric and psychological operations in the latter half of the 20th century. Lessons drawn from POW camp strategies informed the development of programs designed to manage morale, influence behavior, and project presence in environments where conventional dominance was constrained. In the Cold War, military strategists recognized that psychological resilience, cultural literacy, and strategic communication were as critical to operational success as technological innovation or firepower. The ability to influence perception, whether through information campaigns, behavioral nudges, or morale-focused initiatives, reflected the enduring principle exemplified by the American soldiers' singing, that understanding human psychology and exploiting predictable cognitive patterns could yield decisive advantage in both micro and macro contexts of conflict. Equally significant was the enduring lesson for veterans, families, and future military personnel. Resilience, cohesion, and ingenuity are as critical to survival and operational effectiveness as training or equipment. The acts of singing within POW camps symbolized more than a tactical advantage. They represented the assertion of humanity in conditions designed to strip it away. Veterans' memoirs, letters, and post-war interviews frequently recount the lasting emotional impact of these experiences, noting that the capacity to create, perform, and project morale, even in captivity, imbued soldiers with a sense of agency, pride, and purpose that survived long after the war ended. For families and historians alike, these stories offer a vivid testament to the indomitable human spirit and the ways in which ingenuity and courage can flourish. Under extreme adversity, the implications for modern warfare are equally profound. In contemporary military operations, from the Gulf War to modern peacekeeping and counterinsurgency campaigns, commanders have increasingly recognized that psychological influence, morale management, and cultural insight are force multipliers of strategic significance. The principles demonstrated in POW camps, leveraging subtle human-centered tactics to shape behavior and perception, have informed training programs, doctrine, and operational planning. The American experience revealed that the effective projection of confidence, unity, and human ingenuity could achieve effects that conventional weaponry could not. offering a model for leveraging intangible assets to secure tangible outcomes. Modern network-centric warfare, with its emphasis on coordination, communication, and influence, echoes these lessons. Connection, perception, and morale often outweigh sheer firepower in determining operational success beyond the battlefield. The legacy of these practices extends into broader cultural and historical memory. The stories of singing in POW camps challenge conventional narratives of captivity and domination, highlighting that acts of creativity, humanity, and resilience can serve as instruments of strategic influence. They demonstrate that conflict is not solely defined by destruction and submission, but also by subtle negotiation, ingenuity, and the assertion of human agency. For military historians, these episodes provide compelling case studies in the integration of psychological insight into operational strategy. For the general public, they offer a vivid illustration of how courage and creativity can manifest in unexpected forms, reshaping circumstances even in the harshest conditions. Field Marshal Keitel and other contemporaneous military leaders later reflected, with a mixture of respect and incredulity, on the effectiveness of such tactics. They recognized that while the Japanese had relied on superior indoctrination and rigid discipline, the Americans had introduced variables that could not be countered by fear or authority alone. Soldiers' use of song demonstrated that adaptability, emotional intelligence, and cultural literacy could yield decisive results in ways that traditional military thinking often overlooked. The broader implication is clear. Warfare is as much a contest of perception and morale as it is of firepower, territory, or logistics. Commanders who underestimate the psychological dimensions of conflict risk being undermined not by superior hardware, but by the intangible resilience of human ingenuity. The final lesson, enduring and universal, resonates beyond military theory. In conflict, the assertion of humanity, resilience, and creativity can redefine power structures, alter perceptions, and influence outcomes in profound ways. American soldiers singing in Japanese POW camps demonstrated that connection. Courage and emotional intelligence can become instruments of strategy, capable of reshaping the dynamics of control even in the most oppressive circumstances. Their actions remind us that in war, as in life, the intangible qualities of spirit, ingenuity, and cohesion often determine outcomes more decisively than the mightiest weapons. In the theater of captivity, where fear and oppression were meant to dominate, song became a weapon of resilience, morale, and influence, an enduring testament to the extraordinary power of human creativity in the crucible of conflict.